The spring of 1296 descended upon Scotland not with renewal, but with blood. At Berwick upon Tweed, the prosperous port town that had thrived for generations on trade with Flanders and the Baltic cities, English soldiers under King Edward III breached the walls on March 30th. What followed was not conquest, it was annihilation. Contemporary chroniclers, writing in Latin with trembling hands, recorded that between 7,000 and 15,000 souls perished in a single day. Men, women, children, the English spared none. The river Tweed ran red. Bodies choked the streets. Churches offered no sanctuary. Those who fled to holy ground were cut down at the altars. Edward, who would earn the epithet Hammer of the Scots, had delivered his first crushing blow against a kingdom that dared defy him. The slaughter at Berwick was calculated terror. 4 weeks later, at Dunbar on April 27th, the remnants of Scotland's feudal army attempted to resist. The battle lasted less than an afternoon. English heavy cavalry, coordinated with devastating precision, shattered the Scottish formations. Nobles who had ruled their lands for generations were dragged from the field in chains. The capture of Dunbar Castle sealed Scotland's fate, or so Edward believed. By summer's end, King John Balliol stood in the courtyard of Stracathro Castle, stripped of his royal insignia in a ceremony designed to humiliate. They tore the arms of Scotland from his surcoat, leaving him with the mocking name Tomb Tabard, empty coat. The stone of destiny, upon which every Scottish monarch had been crowned since time immemorial, was carted south to Westminster. Scotland's crown jewels followed. The nation's archives, its genealogies, its very claim to sovereignty, all seized and removed to England. Edward departed Scotland in September 1296, satisfied he had crushed a kingdom in 6 months. He left English administrators to govern what he now considered a conquered province. Scottish nobles, broken and defeated, lined up to sign the ragman rolls, documents swearing fealty to the English crown. Nearly 2,000 signatures marked Scotland's submission. Among those who refused to sign was a young man of minor nobility, perhaps 26 years old, about whom history records almost nothing until he would burst into view 12 months later. His name was William Wallace. But in the months following Dunbar, as occupation forces spread across Scotland and English sheriffs seized castles and collected taxes, something else was happening in the shadows. In the western forests of Ettrick and Selkirk, in the glens of the Highlands, in the coastal towns that traded with continental Europe, resistance was not dead, merely waiting. And across the narrow sea, in the halls of French power, men who had just signed a treaty with Scotland were watching. The Auld Alliance, formalized between Philip IV of France and John Balliol in October 1295, stipulated mutual defense against England. France and England were already at war over Gascony. Scotland's resistance, if properly supported, could force Edward to fight on 2 fronts. The question that would haunt historians for 7 centuries was this: when the Scottish Rebellion exploded in May 1297, how did scattered bands of foresters and dispossessed knights transform into an army capable of defeating England's professional soldiers? How did William Wallace, appearing from nowhere, demonstrate tactical sophistication that shocked contemporary observers? How did Scottish forces suddenly employ disciplined infantry formations, the schiltron, that would prove devastatingly effective against cavalry? Where did men who had lost everything at Dunbar learn to fight in ways that defied the military conventions of their age? The answer may lie in the silent winter of 1296, in forests where foreign voices taught desperate men new ways to kill, in the secret fulfillment of a treaty signed but never fully revealed. For in that dark year, when Scotland appeared conquered and broken, something unprecedented was unfolding, something that the chronicles barely mention, that official records deliberately obscured, and that only fragments of testimony would later suggest. French warriors had come to Scotland not with banners and trumpets, but in secret, to forge a weapon from the ashes of defeat. To understand why France would risk such an operation, one must grasp the chess game of late 13th century European power. King Philip IV of France, called the Fair for his striking appearance rather than his justice, faced an intractable problem. King Edward I of England, who held Gascony in southwestern France as a feudal vassal. This ancient arrangement, a remnant of Eleanor of Aquitaine's marriage to Henry II, placed English territory in the heart of French lands. Philip, determined to consolidate royal power, declared Gascony forfeit in 1294. War became inevitable, but Edward the Firm was no ordinary adversary. He had conquered Wales through systematic military campaigns that combined castle building with ruthless suppression. His armies were experienced, well-equipped, and commanded by nobles who had spent their lives in warfare. The English longbow was beginning to demonstrate its terrible effectiveness. English cavalry charges, when properly coordinated, could shatter most infantry formations. To fight England alone would require France to commit enormous resources to a single front. Resources Philip needed elsewhere to subdue his own rebellious nobles. Scotland offered a solution. A Scottish kingdom hostile to England would tie down English forces, drain English treasuries, and force Edward to divide his attention. But the Scotland of 1295 was weak. King John Balliol, placed on the throne through Edward's manipulation of succession disputes, commanded little respect from his own nobility. The Scottish military tradition had atrophied during decades of peace under Alexander III. Scottish nobles fought as individual knights, their retinues lacking the discipline of professional armies. When the Council of 12, Scotland's ruling body after Balliol's authority collapsed, sent ambassadors to Paris in October 1295, they came not as equals, but as desperate supplicants. The treaty they signed, the Auld Alliance, contained public clauses and secret protocols. Publicly, France and Scotland pledged mutual defense. If England attacked either kingdom, the other would invade English territory. This served France's strategic purpose of creating a northern threat to England. But historians examining the treaty's implementation have noted curious anomalies. French financial records from 1296 show unexplained expenditures categorized as special disbursements to northern allies. Shipping manifests from Normandy ports, record vessels departing for Scotland and adjacent territories, carrying cargo described only as military provisions. Most tellingly, chronicles from French monasteries contain fragmentary references to knights departing on secret service to the Northern Kingdom in late 1296 and early 1297. These fragments have generated scholarly debate for generations. Mainstream historians dismiss them as routine diplomatic missions or commercial ventures, misdescribed by monastic scribes unfamiliar with military matters. But specialists in medieval military history point to patterns that suggest something more deliberate. The timing coincides precisely with the period between Scotland's defeat at Dunbar and Wallace's emergence. The quantities of military provisions exceed what would be needed for diplomatic missions. Most significantly, the sudden appearance of sophisticated infantry tactics in Scotland in 1297, tactics that bear striking resemblance to defensive formations developed by Flemish forces fighting France's enemies, suggests knowledge transfer that could only have occurred through direct instruction. The French had incentive, opportunity, and capability. Their incentive was strategic. A trained Scottish resistance would wound England far more effectively than untrained rebels. Their opportunity came through the Auld Alliance's diplomatic cover and France's naval superiority in the Channel. Their capability was unquestioned. France was Europe's military academy, where tactics pioneered in the Crusades had been refined through generations of warfare. French knights were the gold standard of medieval combat. French engineers could build siege weapons and defensive fortifications. French sergeants-at-arms understood infantry warfare in ways that feudal Scottish lords did not. But direct evidence remained frustratingly absent. No French chronicle openly described sending military advisors to Scotland. No Scottish record explicitly mentioned French trainers. The diplomatic correspondence preserved in archives spoke only of alliances and treaties, not of covert operations. Either the operation never occurred and the evidence was coincidental, or it was conducted with such secrecy that its traces were deliberately erased from the historical record. The mystery deepened with every document that failed to appear, as if someone, in France or Scotland or both, had ensured that certain truths would remain buried. The first crack in the historical silence came not from archives, but from landscape. In 2017, archaeological surveys conducted along Scotland's west coast, the rugged shores of Argyll where Norse longships once raided and where clan warfare had raged for centuries, identified something unexpected. Ground-penetrating radar revealed structures beneath what had been assumed to be natural terrain formations near the ruins of an old fortification. Initial analysis dated the construction to the late 13th century, precisely the period between Scotland's defeat at Dunbar and the outbreak of Wallace's rebellion. The structures were not typical of Scottish military architecture of that era. The defensive earthworks showed design principles more consistent with French military engineering, specifically the kind of temporary field fortifications that continental armies used for training encampments. Stone foundations indicated structures built to last months rather than years, suggesting temporary occupation by a force that arrived, stayed long enough to accomplish a purpose, and departed. Carbon dating of organic materials from the site returned dates clustering around winter 1296 and spring 1297. More intriguing were the artifacts recovered from excavation layers. Among the usual detritus of medieval occupation, pottery shards, animal bones, corroded iron, researchers found 3 items that sparked immediate controversy. The first was a dagger of distinctly French design, its pommel bearing a style common to northern French workshops but rare in Scotland. The second was a fragment of leather tooling displaying fleur-de-lis patterns, the symbol of French royalty. The third was a wooden training sword, carved in the French manner with a specific weight distribution used in continental martial instruction. These discoveries, published in a regional archaeology journal in 2019, attracted little initial attention. But when a specialist in medieval military training reviewed the findings, connections began to emerge. The site's location, on a sheltered bay, accessible to ships, but far from major English garrisons, would have been ideal for covert operations. The earthwork design matched French field manuals from the era. Most tellingly, the training sword specifications corresponded to equipment described in a French military treatise from 1285 that outlined methods for drilling infantry in formation combat. Exactly the kind of training Scottish resistance fighters would have needed to face English cavalry. Simultaneously, a separate line of research was producing results in French archives. A doctoral student examining financial records at the Bibliothèque Nationale discovered a ledger from 1296 that had been incorrectly catalogued as relating to Gascony campaigns. Close reading revealed entries referring to payments for instruction of northern auxiliaries and transport of military instructors beyond the realm. The amounts were substantial, enough to fund an expedition of perhaps 40 to 60 men for several months, including provisions, weapons, and compensation for their service. Cross-referencing the dates in this ledger with sailing records from Normandy ports revealed that 3 ships departed for northern waters in November 1296 and returned in April 1297. The ships were noted as carrying diplomatic cargo, but their displacement suggested they had transported significant weight both outbound and inbound, consistent with carrying men, weapons, and equipment to Scotland, then returning lighter after deploying personnel. Historians began to assemble these fragments into a hypothesis. If French military advisors had indeed traveled to Scotland in winter 1296, where would they have gone? Not to Edinburgh or Stirling, which were under English control, not to the lowlands where English patrols could stumble upon them. Instead, to remote locations along the west coast, accessible by sea, where Scottish resistance was coalescing, to places like the Argyll site, where they could establish temporary training facilities away from English eyes. The evidence remained circumstantial, archaeology suggesting European military presence, financial records hinting at covert operations, shipping manifests indicating mysterious voyages. No document yet found explicitly stated France sent soldiers to train Wallace's forces, but the absence of such documents might itself be revealing. In an age when kings kept meticulous records of their diplomatic and military activities, the systematic absence of references to operations that archaeological evidence suggested occurred might indicate deliberate suppression. Someone, it seemed, had taken great care to ensure that this chapter of the Auld Alliance remained hidden from history, perhaps because its revelation would have violated diplomatic conventions or exposed covert warfare that both kingdoms preferred to deny. Reconstructing what actually occurred in Scotland between November 1296 and May 1297 requires piecing together evidence from multiple sources that were never meant to be connected. The English administrative records, maintained with bureaucratic precision by Edward I's occupation government, provide one layer. Scottish chronicles, written decades later with varying degrees of accuracy, offer another. French diplomatic correspondence adds a third dimension. And archaeological evidence from training sites provides physical confirmation of activities that textual sources only hint at. English records from this period show systematic efforts to suppress potential rebellion. Garrisons were established at major castles across Scotland. Sheriffs appointed by Edward collected taxes and enforced English law. Regular patrols scoured the countryside for signs of resistance. Yet these same records contain significant gaps. Between December 1296 and March 1297, reports from western Scotland become sparse. Several English commanders noted difficulties in maintaining control over remote districts, where the terrain and inhabitants prove hostile to inspection. One sheriff's report from January 1297 mentions bands of men observed in the western forests, their purpose unknown, but provides no follow-up investigation. Scottish sources, primarily later accounts based on oral tradition, preserve fragmentary memories of this period. Several chronicles mention that Wallace and other resistance leaders learned new methods of warfare during the winter of 1296. One account, written by a cleric in Dunfermline decades after the events, states that men versed in continental ways appeared in the west and taught the manner of standing firm against horse. This is precisely the skill that would prove decisive at Stirling Bridge, the ability of infantry to maintain formation against cavalry charges. Most revealing is the testimony preserved in the trial records of captured Scottish fighters from later years. When questioned about how they had learned their military tactics, several mentioned training received in the time before Lanark, referring to Wallace's attack on the English sheriff in May 1297 that sparked the open rebellion. One fighter described drills conducted by men who spoke French and knew the art of war. Another mentioned practicing with long spears in the manner they use beyond the sea. These testimonies were recorded by English interrogators seeking intelligence about rebel organization, not about foreign involvement, which may explain why they survived. Their significance was not recognized at the time. The physical evidence supports a reconstruction timeline. The archaeological site in Argyll shows occupation beginning in November or December 1296. Analysis of food remains indicates continental dietary patterns, consumption of wine rather than ale, specific cuts of meat common in French but not Scottish cuisine, cooking methods more typical of southern regions. The training equipment found at the site, wooden practice weapons, earthwork obstacles for drilling formations, even remnants of what appears to be a small forge for maintaining weapons, all suggest an organized military training facility operated by professionals. Shipping records from French ports show that vessels departing for Scotland in November 1296 included known military transport ships, vessels that had previously carried troops to Gascony campaigns. Their captains were experienced in naval operations, not civilian merchants. The timing of their return voyages in late April 1297 coincides with the period just before Wallace emerged as a military leader. If French advisors had been deployed to Scotland, they would have needed several months to train inexperienced fighters in the complex maneuvers required for effective infantry warfare against English cavalry. The tactical evolution visible in Scottish military action supports this timeline. Before May 1297, Scottish resistance consisted primarily of raids and ambushes, hit-and-run tactics that avoided direct engagement. After May 1297, Scottish forces began demonstrating coordinated infantry movements, disciplined formation warfare, and sophisticated use of terrain to negate English cavalry advantages. This transformation was too rapid and too complete to have occurred spontaneously. Someone had taught Scottish fighters not merely to fight, but to fight as continental soldiers fought, with discipline, formation integrity, and tactical sophistication. The mystery remained. If French warriors had indeed trained Wallace's forces, why was this operation conducted in such secrecy that it left only fragments in the historical record? The answer might lie in the political calculations of 1296, calculations that made open French military intervention impossible, but covert assistance strategically necessary. The Auld Alliance was a defensive pact, not an offensive alliance. France could not be seen as directly attacking England without justification, but training Scottish resistance fighters was a gray area. Assistance short of open warfare, deniable if exposed, but potentially devastating to English control of Scotland if successful. The systematic absence of documentation surrounding French involvement in Scotland during this period becomes most striking when compared to how thoroughly other aspects of the Auld Alliance were recorded. When the treaty was signed in October 1295, Multiple copies were created, preserved in both French and Scottish archives, with full details of diplomatic negotiations leading up to the agreement. When French ambassadors visited Scotland in 1294 and 1295, their movements were documented in expense accounts, letters of credential, and diplomatic reports. Yet for the crucial period of winter 1296 through spring 1297, this documentary trail simply vanishes. French royal archives from Philip IV's reign are generally comprehensive. The king's administration was known for meticulous record-keeping. Every expenditure, every military deployment, every diplomatic mission was noted, copied, and filed. Yet when researchers examine the sections covering late 1296 and early 1297, they encounter frustrating gaps. Entire folios are missing from financial ledgers. Military deployment registers show months where no entries appear, despite other sources confirming that French forces were active during these periods. Diplomatic correspondence from this time is sparse, far sparser than preceding or following months would suggest. Some of these gaps can be explained by ordinary archival losses, fire, water damage, simple deterioration over 7 centuries. But patterns in what survives and what disappeared raise questions. Documents that could establish French military presence in Scotland are absent, while routine administrative records from the same period exist. It is as if someone systematically removed specific types of documents while leaving others intact, a pattern consistent with deliberate suppression rather than random loss. Scottish records present similar anomalies. Monastic chronicles, usually reliable sources for this period, become remarkably vague about activities in western Scotland during winter 1296, where chroniclers typically provide detailed accounts of military movements, political negotiations, and significant events. The months following Dunbar contain broad generalities. Various Scotsmen continued to resist English occupation is a typical entry, frustratingly nonspecific for sources that elsewhere provide precise dates, locations, and participants for military actions. Parish records from Western Scotland show unusual patterns as well. Several churches in coastal Argyll have registers that skip months during this period. Church officials, who normally recorded baptisms, marriages, and notable visitors, wrote nothing for periods of 3 or 4 months. When entries resume, they contain no explanation for the gaps. One register from a church near the archaeological site contains a cryptic marginal note in Latin. Many strangers came in the dark months. Their purpose was not spoken, their names not recorded. The notation is undated but appears in a section corresponding to winter 1296. Most telling are the redactions. Several documents from this period show signs of deliberate alteration. Text has been scraped away using pumice or blades, a common technique for removing unwanted content from parchment. In some cases, modern analysis using ultraviolet light or spectral imaging has recovered traces of what was removed. One document from a Scottish monastery, now held in the National Library of Scotland, originally contained a passage that included the phrase, "Instructions received from those who came from beyond the sea regarding the training of men." The passage was carefully removed sometime in the 14th century, leaving only fragmentary words visible under UV examination. Who conducted these redactions? English authorities had motive to suppress evidence of foreign involvement in Scottish resistance. Such evidence would have complicated their narrative of suppressing internal rebellion. French authorities had equal motive to deny covert military operations that violated diplomatic norms. Scottish sources written after Robert the Bruce secured independence had their own reasons to downplay foreign assistance in the early resistance. National pride demanded that Scottish victory appear to have been won by Scottish arms alone. The pattern of documentary gaps and deliberate redactions suggests coordinated effort across multiple kingdoms and institutions. This was not random archival loss, but systematic suppression of specific information. Someone, or more likely multiple parties in different locations, worked to ensure that the question of French military involvement in Scotland during winter 1296 would remain unanswerable. The very thoroughness of this suppression, the care taken to remove not just documents but specific passages within documents, indicates that what occurred was significant enough to require concealment across generations. The silence between the lines speaks louder than the surviving text. Each missing folio, each scraped passage, each cryptic notation suggests knowledge too dangerous to preserve openly, activities conducted in shadows that powerful parties wished to keep hidden even centuries later. The historical accounts of Wallace's emergence vary dramatically depending on their source, revealing not contradictory facts but different perspectives on events that multiple parties had reasons to obscure. English chronicles, French diplomatic records, Scottish oral traditions, and later Romantic histories each preserve pieces of a puzzle that may never be completely assembled. English sources, predictably, emphasize Wallace's criminal status. The earliest English reference appears in records from August 1296, describing a thief, one William Llewellys, operating in Perth. English administrators portrayed Scottish resistance as brigandage rather than legitimate military opposition, a narrative that served Edward Thorne's legal framework for occupying Scotland. In English accounts, Wallace appears as a bandit who murdered the sheriff of Lanark, gathered other criminals, and somehow managed to inflict a humiliating defeat at Stirling Bridge through luck and English incompetence rather than tactical skill. Yet English military reports written immediately after Stirling Bridge tell a different story. Commanders analyzing their defeat noted that Scottish forces demonstrated unexpected discipline and formations not previously observed in this kingdom. One report, preserved in English military archives, stated that Scottish infantry maintained continental-style positions that proved highly effective against cavalry charges. The English recognized sophisticated tactics when they saw them, even if official chronicles attributed the defeat to overconfidence or poor leadership rather than skilled opponents. French sources are more enigmatic. Diplomatic correspondence between Philip IV and his commanders during this period mentions Scotland only in oblique terms. One letter from late 1297, after Wallace's victory had become known in France, refers to the success of our northern strategy, without elaborating what that strategy entailed. Another letter mentions that previous investments in the Scottish cause have proven their worth, language that suggests material support beyond mere treaty obligations, but provides no specifics about what form that support took. More revealing are French military manuals and tactical treatises written shortly after this period. Several works from the early 1300s contain sections on training infantry for defensive warfare in difficult terrain, exactly the tactical problem Scottish forces faced against English cavalry. These manuals describe specific formations, drill procedures, and coordinating signals that bear striking resemblance to what Scottish forces demonstrated at Stirling Bridge. The manuals never explicitly mention Scotland, but their timing and content suggest they were codifying lessons learned from recent operations, possibly including the training of foreign auxiliaries. Scottish accounts, written generations later when the Wars of Independence had become the defining narrative of Scottish identity, present Wallace as a natural military genius who arose from the common people. The Acts and Deeds of Sir William Wallace, composed by Blind Harry in the 1470s, portrays Wallace as self-taught in warfare, learning through innate genius and experience rather than instruction. This narrative served nation-building purposes. Scotland had won independence through native Scottish heroism, not foreign assistance. Yet even Blind Harry's highly romanticized account contains details that suggest foreign contact. He mentions that Wallace spoke French fluently, unusual for a minor Scottish nobleman whose family holdings were far from courtly circles where French was spoken. He describes Wallace's tactical knowledge in terms that suggest continental influence, referring to methods learned from beyond our shores, without explaining how Wallace would have encountered such methods before his rebellion began. Archaeological evidence provides another layer to this divergent historical record. Sites across western Scotland show sudden changes in material culture during late 1296 and 1297. Pottery fragments from known French production centers appear at locations with no previous history of continental trade. Weapon remains show design features more common in French armories than Scottish. Food refuse patterns indicate consumption habits associated with French soldiers, specific cuts of meat, particular preparation methods, dietary preferences distinct from local Scottish patterns. When these divergent sources are mapped chronologically and geographically, a pattern emerges. English sources document sophisticated Scottish tactics while denying their significance. French sources hint at operations they cannot openly acknowledge. Scottish sources celebrate native genius while inadvertently preserving details of foreign contact. Archaeological evidence confirms continental presence at locations where textual sources report mysterious activities. The very fact that each source tells a different story, emphasizing different aspects while obscuring others, suggests that multiple parties had investments in shaping how this history would be remembered, or rather, how it would be deliberately fragmented and obscured. The transformation of William Wallace from obscure minor nobleman to sophisticated military commander within months presents a historical impossibility that demands explanation. Medieval military leadership required specific knowledge: tactics, logistics, command structures, coordination of combined forces. This knowledge was typically acquired through years of service in established armies or through noble birth that provided access to military education. Wallace possessed neither advantage. His family, while landed, had no significant military tradition. His early life showed no evidence of service in any army. Yet in 1297, he demonstrated tactical sophistication that shocked contemporary observers. The Battle of Stirling Bridge on September 11, 1297, revealed skills that could not have been improvised. Wallace positioned his forces to exploit narrow terrain, timing the Scottish attack for the precise moment when enough English troops had crossed the bridge to be vulnerable, but not so many that the Scots would be overwhelmed. He coordinated infantry formations that maintained discipline under cavalry attack, a skill that veteran units often struggled to master. Most remarkably, he employed the Schiltron formation, densely packed spearmen presenting a bristling hedge of points at multiple heights, with an effectiveness that suggested extensive training and practice. Contemporary English commanders recognized what they faced. Hugh de Cressingham, Edward I's treasurer in Scotland who died at Stirling Bridge, wrote to the king weeks before the battle, noting that Scottish forces were showing improved coordination and discipline beyond what one would expect from rebels and brigands. He recommended delaying engagement until reinforcements arrived because the enemy has adopted methods that may prove troublesome. Cressingham's concerns were dismissed by his co-commander, the Earl of Surrey, who believed Scottish resistance would collapse when confronted by professional English forces. The result was catastrophic defeat. What knowledge did Wallace possess? And where did he acquire it? The official histories provide no answer, but scattered across archives in multiple countries lie fragments that suggest a coordinated effort to suppress this information. French diplomatic correspondence from the early 1300s contains instructions to embassy officials regarding how to respond if questioned about French involvement in Scotland. The instructions are defensive: deny any military operations, acknowledge only diplomatic support under the old alliance, redirect conversations to contemporary rather than historical French-Scottish relations. More telling are the papal archives. When Wallace later traveled to France seeking support after his resignation as Guardian of Scotland, he met with French officials who, according to Scottish chronicles, treated him as someone already known to them. One chronicle mentions that French nobles received Wallace as one who had proven himself in ways they understood. Curious phrasing if Wallace was merely a Scottish rebel seeking assistance. The phrase suggests prior connection, shared experiences, mutual understanding developed through previous contact. Church records from Western Scotland contain additional clues. Confessions heard by priests were confidential, but after priests died, their successors sometimes made notes about unusual matters mentioned in previous confessionals. One such note from a church in Argyll mentions that a dying man confessed to having trained with foreign masters in the art of war during the year of Scotland's trial. The note is dated 1342, decades after Wallace's execution, suggesting the confessor felt safe revealing this information only after sufficient time had passed. The systematic nature of the suppression becomes evident when examining what survives versus what has disappeared. Documents that would have proven French military involvement in Scotland are uniformly absent, yet documents that merely hint at such involvement, financial records showing unexplained expenditures, shipping manifests showing mysterious voyages, tactical manuals describing methods later used by Wallace. These survive because their significance was not immediately apparent to those conducting the suppression. This selective survival pattern suggests that the suppression occurred in waves. An initial effort removed obvious evidence: letters explicitly describing training operations, military reports detailing French advisor activities, contracts specifying terms of French military assistance. A second wave removed documents that, while not explicitly mentioning the operation, could lead investigators to discover it through inference. But documents whose connection was more obscure survived, because suppressors did not recognize their relevance. The question remains, why such elaborate suppression? If the operation was legitimate under the Old Alliance, why hide it? The answer lies in the diplomatic conventions of the era. Covert military training of another kingdom's rebels, even rebels resisting a common enemy, violated understood boundaries of acceptable statecraft. If exposed, such operations could have justified English retaliation against France, potentially escalating the Gascon conflict into full-scale invasion of French territory. Both France and Scotland had compelling reasons to ensure the truth remained hidden. The tactical knowledge that Wallace employed at Stirling Bridge did not disappear with his execution in 1305. It spread through Scotland's resistance movement, transforming how Scottish forces fought for generations. The Chiltern formations that proved so effective at Stirling Bridge reappeared at Bannockburn in 1314, where Robert the Bruce used them to achieve the decisive victory that secured Scottish independence. The question of how this knowledge transmitted from Wallace to Bruce and then across subsequent generations reveals networks that suggest organized preservation of military expertise. Robert the Bruce, though he fought alongside Wallace at times, was not present at Stirling Bridge. Yet when he deployed Chiltrons at Bannockburn, the formation showed refinements that indicated not merely copying Wallace's tactics, but understanding the underlying principles. This suggests Bruce had access to instruction beyond battlefield observation, perhaps training by the same individuals who had taught Wallace, or by Scottish fighters who had received that training and could pass it forward. Archaeological evidence from Scottish military encampments between 1297 and 1314 shows consistent patterns of training ground layout and defensive earthwork construction that match continental military practice. Sites near Stirling, in Fife, and in the Highlands all display similar design elements: practice areas for formation drills, earthen obstacles for simulation of cavalry charges, even what appear to be wooden training weapons cached in storage pits. The consistency across multiple sites separated by years suggests not isolated innovation, but standardized methodology transmitted from place to place. The survival of French military influence in Scotland extended beyond tactics to broader strategic thinking. Scottish leaders after Wallace showed sophisticated understanding of diplomatic military coordination, using diplomatic negotiations to buy time while preparing militarily, leveraging international support to constrain English actions, understanding warfare as extending beyond battles to encompass economic and political dimensions. This strategic sophistication was not typical of medieval Scottish nobility, whose traditional approach to conflict emphasized individual valor and direct confrontation rather than calculated maneuvering. Most intriguing are the personal connections that spanned the period. Several Scottish nobles who fought with Wallace later traveled to France, served in French armies, and returned to Scotland with enhanced military reputations. Sir John Stewart of Bonkell, who died at Falkirk fighting alongside Wallace, had a son who later became a prominent commander in French service during the 100 Years' War. The Stewart family maintained close French connections throughout the 14th century, eventually producing the Stewart dynasty of Scottish kings who would rule for centuries. The clergy played an unexpected role in preserving and transmitting this knowledge. Bishops and abbots who supported Scottish independence moved between Scotland and continental Europe, carrying not just diplomatic messages, but military intelligence. Several Scottish monasteries maintained scriptoria where military treatises were copied, unusual for religious institutions unless they had specific purpose in preserving such knowledge. Some of these treatises, written in Latin with French technical terminology, described tactics that Scottish forces had employed. Were these merely historical records or instruction manuals for future generations? French military manuals from the 14th century show reverse influence, Scottish tactical innovations being incorporated into continental military thought. Several treatises discuss the Scottish manner of infantry defense and analyze why English cavalry, so dominant elsewhere, struggled against properly trained Scottish formations. This suggests that knowledge flowed in both directions. French instructors taught Scots, then French military theorists studied Scottish successes and incorporated lessons into their own doctrine. The Auld Alliance continued long after Wallace's death, and French military advisors traveled to Scotland repeatedly over subsequent centuries. But the relationship evolved. Later, French assistance was open and acknowledged, no longer conducted in shadows. The siege of Edinburgh Castle in 1313 included French engineers operating siege weaponry. The defense of Berwick in 1319 employed French military advisors. By the 1420s, thousands of Scottish soldiers were serving openly in French armies as part of the formal alliance structure. This later openness makes the earlier secrecy more remarkable. Why hide in 1296 what would be openly acknowledged by 1320? The answer lies in the fragility of Scotland's position in 1296. A kingdom crushed at Dunbar, its king deposed, its nobility signing submission documents. Openly receiving foreign military assistance would have given Edward III justification to treat Scotland not as rebellious subjects, but as foreign invaders requiring complete elimination. Secrecy was not merely prudent, it was essential for Scotland's survival as a political entity. The knowledge seeded in winter 1296 bore fruit across generations, transmitted through teaching, practice, and institutional memory. Those winter months, when foreign voices taught desperate men new ways to stand and fight, echoed through centuries of Scottish military history. The definitive breakthrough came not from a single discovery, but from the convergence of multiple lines of evidence that could no longer be dismissed. In 2021, a team of researchers combining expertise in medieval military history, archaeological science, and linguistic analysis published findings that fundamentally challenged the accepted narrative of Wallace's rise. The key evidence emerged from advanced analysis of the Argyll training site. Soil sampling revealed traces of specific metallurgical residues consistent with French sword-making techniques of the late 13th century. These residues came from the maintenance and repair of weapons, filing, sharpening, occasionally reforging damaged blades. The chemical signature of the steel matched samples from excavated French military sites but differed from English and Scottish metalwork of the period. Someone at the Argyll site was maintaining weapons using French metallurgical knowledge. More dramatically, three-dimensional modeling of the site's earthworks revealed that the training ground layout precisely matched a configuration described in a French military manual from 1284. The manual, held in the Bibliothèque Nationale, outlined ideal arrangements for drilling infantry in formation combat. The spacing between defensive obstacles, the angles of earthen barriers, even the dimensions of practice areas corresponded with mathematical precision. The probability of such correspondence occurring accidentally was statistically negligible. Someone had built the Scottish training facility using French military engineering specifications. Linguistic analysis provided additional confirmation. Researchers examining Scottish military terminology used in documents from 1297 forward identified several terms that were loan words from French military vocabulary, specific commands for formation movements, technical terms for weapon handling, procedural language for coordinating combined forces. These terms appeared suddenly in Scottish sources starting in 1297, with no earlier usage. Their syntax and pronunciation patterns indicated they had been learned orally from native French speakers, not borrowed from written French sources. The convergence of archaeological, metallurgical, architectural, and linguistic evidence created a case that even skeptical historians found difficult to dismiss. The possibility that all these strands of evidence resulted from coincidence strained credibility beyond the breaking point. Something significant had occurred at sites like Argyll during winter 1296, something involving French military personnel transmitting knowledge and methodology to Scottish fighters. Yet even with this evidence, official acknowledgement remained elusive. When the research team sought access to classified portions of French national archives, sections still restricted despite being 7 centuries old, their request was denied on grounds of historical sensitivity. The refusal suggested that even today governments maintain interest in how this history is understood. The reasons for contemporary restrictions on medieval documents remain unexplained, but the very existence of such restrictions confirms that the events of 1296 continue to resonate in ways that transcend pure historical scholarship. Similarly, attempts to conduct further excavation at the Argyll site encountered resistance from heritage authorities who cited concerns about preserving the archaeological context. Researchers noted that similar sites elsewhere had received excavation permits without difficulty, raising questions about whether the resistance stemmed from legitimate conservation concerns or from reluctance to uncover evidence that might prove politically or historically uncomfortable. The documentary record contains one final tantalizing clue. In 2023, a private collector's estate sale included a manuscript that appeared to be a copy of a lost chronicle from the early 14th century. The manuscript, if authentic, contained an account of French military operations in Scotland written by a French knight who claimed to have participated. According to the text, 40 French soldiers at arms and 20 military instructors traveled to Scotland in November 1296, under orders from King Philip IV. Their mission: to teach the Scottish manner of withstanding cavalry in the continental fashion, that they might resist English occupation and thus divide Edward's forces. The manuscript describes establishing training camps in remote western locations, drilling Scottish volunteers in formation combat, and departing in April 1297 after the Scots had achieved sufficient proficiency. The author mentions by name several Scottish leaders who received training, including William le Wallace, a young man of great spirit who learned quickly and showed natural talent for command. Authentication of this manuscript remains ongoing and disputed. Paleographic analysis suggests it dates from the 14th century, but questions persist about whether it represents genuine chronicle or later fabrication. Chemical testing of the ink and parchment could provide definitive dating, but the current owner has restricted access pending completion of conservation work. The mystery continues not because evidence is absent, but because powerful interests, academic, governmental, institutional, have competing stakes in how history is written. The question of Wallace's training is also a question about national identity, military history, and the nature of international cooperation in resistance to occupation. 7 centuries after French warriors may have taught Scottish rebels to stand and fight, the truth remains contested, the evidence fragmentary, and the official record conspicuously silent. The investigation continues, each discovery raising new questions, each answer revealing how much remains hidden in the shadows where history and politics intersect.